Well, good morning, and thank you very much, David, for organizing today. I call this the Hart-Hufbauer or the Patterson-Peterson debate. And I'd like to welcome you to that. I'm doing some writing right now, so I'm very aware of alliterations. And as you see from the biographical details that follow on page 18 and 19 of the pamphlet, Michael is from Patterson and Gary is from Peterson, and both have extremely distinguished careers in trade policy, both in the public sector and in academia. And both have been co-authors of mine, so it's a particular, they've carried me along on various projects, and it makes it very pleasant for me today to welcome them here and to try and get them to disagree with each other. I'd like to make a couple of introductory remarks and note that, to me, what we're talking about this morning is North American integration. Perhaps it's not exactly in free fall, but it's certainly moving slowly, so slowly that you might say it's paralyzed. And when I look around the world, our neighborhood is pretty quiet compared to the other neighborhoods, where there's much more vision and much more dynamism on the integration file. The European Union has expanded to include new members. The Asians are busy, like you wouldn't believe, discussing or negotiating so many FTAs that the Asian Development Bank, which tries to keep track of them, has a difficult time doing so. Even China and India are discussing, they started out discussing a free trade agreement. They have beaten themselves back to talking about serious bilateral trade liberalization. East Asia abounds with visions, and there are so many leaders' meetings that one wonders how much time they spend in their capitals. And the whole process has been helped along by unilateral liberalization. And of course, the economic dynamism in the neighborhood right now. And significantly, what their project is about is building mutual trust. So here in North America, we've benefited from the free trades that were agreements that were negotiated more than a decade ago. But since then, the world economy has changed radically, partly because of what's going on in the other neighborhoods. And it makes it desirable to move beyond NAFTA. But there's not much vision. And governments are doing relatively little, and trust is part of the problem. So I welcome the timing of this debate this morning. What David has asked the two authors to do is to present their views in about 20 minutes each, and then we'll open it to the floor for the rest of our time this morning. Nobody told me who's going first, so whoever is, please stand up.
Excuse me. Gary, you're first.
Gary Hufbauer will now address us.
In my allotted time, I will try to do three things: give the views of our presidential candidates very crisply on this issue, then give some post-election scenarios, and then turn to the U.S.-Canada agenda, which is the thrust of the piece that we wrote. So let me turn first to our candidates, the four who are still standing. Senator Clinton has an established record of skepticism towards trade agreements, which began with NAFTA. She was a voice in the White House against NAFTA. And her famous remark of the moment is a timeout. And that was a surprise. She has three advisors who are economists and serious economists. Roger Altman, a Wall Street guy, Laura Tyson, who had been chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and under Clinton, under President Clinton, and Gene Sperling, who's kind of an insider economist, and they were quite surprised by this announcement. So clearly the political people came up with this timeout phrase. And her other phrase is smart trade, and what that means is putting a lot of labor and environment and so forth on trade agreement. Turning to Senator Obama, he voted against CAFTA, Dominican Republic Agreement, and he voted against Peru quite recently. But he has said global trade is not going away. Well, that's obvious. And he said we must enable our workers to compete. And then he goes on to talking about tougher enforcement of existing agreements. His advisor, Goolsbee, very smart guy from Chicago, is a free trader. That's what he said when he's in kind of council formulation meetings and that type of thing. And I guess he feels a little disquiet about this, but he doesn't show it when he's at a public meeting. And then he goes on, Goolsbee goes on and talks about all the rules of origin and so forth, which are not part of the concept of free trade, but instead are protectionist interests in these agreements. But then he doesn't talk about eliminating that. So, you know, you can get a less than enthusiastic impression from the Obama campaign, but not as hard as the Clinton. Now, we turn to Huckabee. He's got a couple of phrases that say it all. This is a great one. He said, "I'm a Walmart Republican, not a Wall Street Republican." And then he asked his people to sign on to God's army. Well, with those views, you don't need to go very far. You kind of know where that's all coming from. He's basically a populist. If he felt a little less constrained, he would really sign on, I think, to Ross Perot's anti-trade, but he doesn't say that, but I think in his heart he feels it. So that leaves one person, that's Senator McCain, who is an unabashed free trader, who has supported every free trade agreement. He's also quite reasonable on immigration. And he's one of the bravest things, he's against ethanol subsidies, so he didn't even campaign in Iowa, as you may know. So, to answer the title of this forum, which is very kind of a brilliant piece of marketing that probably Stephanie came up with, maybe Rosemary. Anyway, free trade policy is in a free fall in the United States. Anyway, free trade policy, that doesn't mean free trade, but the policy is not in good health, and now I turn to the post-election scenario. The only hope for a vigorous pro-trade, pro-globalization agenda in the year 2009 would be a McCain presidency. The others speak for themselves. But you know, there's always a silver lining here. By 2010, the other candidates, whoever is elected amongst these four, if it's not McCain, will, in our view, there's kind of a Peterson Institute view, I'm not speaking for all my colleagues, they will rediscover the international economy, if only for foreign policy reasons. I mean, 2009 will be taken up with health care and, you know, the tax battle and all that kind of thing, but by 2010 they'll have to rediscover, and this is a little bit of optimism, but if there's going to be any progress this year in 2008, the scenario would be to let the two free trade agreements, which are controversial, the one with Colombia and the one with Korea, and Doha, go through during the lame duck session after the election. Even if, let's say, Clinton is elected or Obama or Huckabee possibly, you know, maybe any of these three would say, well, you know, I just don't want to deal with that in 2009, 2010, so you give a free ride to have that go through in the lame duck session after the November election. Possibly Korea and Colombia before, again, on this argument of get it out of the way. We know if we reject them, we've got huge foreign policy problems in Latin America and Asia respectively, so go for it. Don't do to Doha what President Bush did to Kyoto, namely a visible slamming of the door. Now, all that would depend, in the case of Doha, on coming up with some agreement, which is right now remote. So, my picture then ahead is kind of a narrow road. If McCain is elected, he's all for it. He will be limited by the Democratic Congress, Democratic-controlled Congress, which would kind of block or make it harder for an all-out effort. If one of the others is elected, foreign policy and the global economy will prevent, in my view, a backward lurch. But as Wendy said, policy liberalization will at most move at a deliberate pace. Now, this is kind of gloomy, I know, but anyway, the good news there, we're trying to do some calculations at the Peters Institute, is that if we confine ourselves to tariff liberalization, we've looked at the numbers since the late 70s coming forward. Tariff liberalization only accounts for about, at most, maybe 1/3 of the increased globalization of merchandise trade for the United States. Technology is a big factor, and that force will, the technology force will presumably go forward. So it's not that you get some halting of globalization, at least in merchandise trade measured by the trade to gross domestic product ratio. It would still go forward, but maybe not quite as fast, maybe something slower if we have a long time out on policy liberalization. Now let me turn to the third part of our remarks, the U.S.-Canada agenda. And this actually is sort of a potential ray of sunshine in an otherwise overcast sky, because U.S. fears about product safety, security, the race to the bottom on labor and environment, I mean, those fears, they're there, but they are far, far lower with respect to trade with Canada than almost, well, I think almost any other place. Maybe in some areas Europe on a policy sense is going forward, but the fears are the least with respect to Canada. So that's, that's the opening. Now, our paper, the paper that Claire Brunel and I wrote, emphasizes three big reasons for, despite all the progress we've made in the past, for what I would regard as a stunning absence of integration between the U.S. and Canadian economies. And by that, I mean that the level of integration, broadly measured, is about 1/2 of what it could be, should be. So what we see, and that's despite massive flows of people in finance, investment, and so forth. Okay, now we go through the reasons, and we don't necessarily, I know that Michael here is going to put up a straw man on our first one, but we're just observing it, we're not recommending a change, but the absence of a common currency. The econometrics on this is overwhelming, that when you don't have a common currency, you cut your trade, your integration significantly, and you have much more price divergence, which then translates into various kinds of distortions, costly distortions, than you would otherwise have. And there have been 20 good articles written on this subject, and the data is very rich and so forth. So the absence of a common currency, of course, you get a macroeconomic payoff by not having a common currency. In macroeconomic terms, Texas would be better off to have the Texas dollar because it's a natural resource state, put it that way. And it doesn't have the Texas dollar, and for that reason it had a big bust when oil was down, and it's now having a big boom in inflation in Texas and all that. Well, so you get macroeconomic freedom for having your own currency. But at the microeconomic level, which is where most of us live, you introduce quite a bit of separation. And there aren't, I'm not saying it's painless, look at what's happening in Europe now, and the divergence between the core economies and some of the fringe economies, and it's a tough game. But in any event, as long as we want to have our separate currencies, which we do, and we're not recommending go for a common currency, we will have considerable separation, considerable non-integration. Okay, let me turn to the other two. The rising tide of security barriers. I mean, this passport requirement, which you all know, I was talking with Mr. St. John here, the tourism, I mean, this is cutting back. This is one of the factors cutting back U.S. tourism, and his numbers are arresting all the security business. And then we have this cargo security, which is just kind of coming into place in the next 5 years. It will come into place, and it will not hit Canada the way it's going to hit. You take these little African countries, these South American countries, they're going to be really hit by that because they can't meet the cargo security standards. There are probably only 50 ports in the world which will, maybe 100, according to the Bush administration. I think only 50 will pass muster. The others will have to ship their goods someplace else and be reshipped and inspected and on and on. So it's going to be very hard on all these little countries. But anyway, it'll be hard generally, and that's coming down the pipeline, and it will cause some additional friction between U.S. and Canada. Now, so this security tax, which is there and is getting higher, it takes the form of slower shipments, as you know, more border congestion, and reduces trade. It's quite surprising. We're just beginning to get the econometrics on this, but if you add a day to the turnaround time of a ship, you cut trade a lot. It's a big toll. It's surprisingly big, and there's only been a couple of papers done. But it's you increase the shipping time from, let's say, 7 days to 10 days. It's a big toll. Just reliability and so forth. And then when you add variability to it, you have a further problem. Well, that's there, and it certainly differentially impedes the small and medium-sized companies. The U.S. statistics on merchandise trade, where we have the best statistics, I think it applies to finance as well, so on. Not only is the concentration high, but it has gotten higher since 1990. And the top companies, the multinationals, they control about 80% of U.S. merchandise trade. And why is that? Well, it's because the fixed costs of dealing with security and everything else are very high, and if you're a small or medium-sized company, you kind of tend to stay out of business. And this is the security tax is one more fixed cost. And it probably the security tax is working. We don't have any evidence on it, econometric evidence on this, but it probably can work to concentrate direct investment in the United States rather than Canada, as from third countries. And it certainly reduces cross-border tourism. Well, so we come up with several recommendations on this. But what they would require is for Canada to do the heavy lifting, which it has always done in terms of this integration project. And our overriding recommendation is that we ought to move to a North American perimeter in terms of all merchandise trade. But that, unfortunately, would probably require the intrusive presence of the U.S. kind of customs types at Canadian airports, and that might not go down well. But if we had this, less than that, we can get kind of certified factories in Canada, which then can ship on a sealed container basis to the U.S. and get rid of the border. In other words, it's certified at the factory and then it flows through. Now, how to get going on this rather sensible agenda in terms of the cargo side of things? Well, again, the kind of controversial proposal that we put out here is that Canada does the heavy lifting, and it implements sensible policies on goods and people flowing north, and basically gets rid or goes down to a risk assessment, heavy use of intelligence on what cargo you're going to screen, and you don't screen very much of it, 1%, 2%, whatever, and also in terms of people coming across, greatly reducing the security tax going north, and hoping that by doing that, the U.S. gradually has moved to its senses and reduces these security taxes going south. Now, I know that's probably not, probably gets people here a little bit, it doesn't go down easily, But to me, the analogy with what's happening in trucking is very similar. This is with Mexico. I mean, Mexico has shot itself in the foot now for 15 years on trucking. The U.S. is now just beginning to allow trucks to go north, 100 trucks, and there's a lot of litigation on this. And Teamsters trying to stop it and using all the usual kind of anti-Mexican symbolism to do it. But anyway, we're going forward very slowly. But the Mexicans, they made the mistake of reciprocating. And, you know, that adds to the travel time, and the travel time is a big factor. And while Mexico has benefited enormously from NAFTA, it really has cut down its own benefits by not allowing U.S. trucks to go south, pick up the stuff, and come north two-way shipments. So I think there's something on that in the security tax. And then we now turn to the third point and conclude, and that's the regulatory barriers. And it is, I think, fair to say that Michael Hart is now the preeminent scholar on regulatory barriers, if not in the world, certainly in North America. And so I can go straight to the recommendations. He can paint the picture. But I have to start by observing Bill Robson back here. He has proposed unilateral tariff elimination for Canada. I mean, he makes us seem like pikers. He's really going for the whole thing, unilateral tariff elimination for Canada, instead of going out and sending these people to these wonderful negotiating sessions where they get good food and fine wine and so forth and so on. I mean, that's a very bold and actually a very sensible proposal. I think from the Mexican negotiators, and they're even more. They even send more people out. I have about 30 FTAs now. And Bill, hopefully he'll speak later and explain all the reasons why this might not happen, but it's a very sensible approach. Well, Michael Hart could do the same thing on the regulatory barriers. And what does that mean? That means that the government ought to pull Michael out of this comfortable retirement he's enjoying at the Patterson School, you know, this easy living he's doing, and put him back in charge of kind of chief regulatory harmonization between the U.S. and Canada. And what would be his remit? Well, the first thing is to follow the Bill Robson model and get Canada to accept U.S. regulatory standards unless there is a very strong, overwhelming reason to keep the Canadian model. Just do it. Just accept it. I mean, you know, the problem with these regulatory standards, and one reason they don't get very much attention in negotiating, is they're quite boring. To anybody except those, it's like your taxes. I mean, your tax problem is boring to everybody except you when you fill out your tax form and deal with the AMT or whatever you're dealing, wrestling with. Well, the same with all this regulatory stuff. It just doesn't get any juice for politicians. If we could get, that's the point. Not go back to all that stuff that's there, the thousands of pages in any given area, but the new stuff, get the Canadian voice on comment consultation. That would be the second thing. And then third thing, and part of this, very important, is to forge a common food safety regime, common inspectors, integrate these forces. If we can't do it between U.S. and Canada, how can it be done anyplace else? But it should be possible, for all the reasons Michael has said. And then, kind of most importantly, moving forward, or what will get a lot of high-profile attention, is move the file on common CO2 climate change standards, particularly when it comes to cross-border trade and the competitiveness issues. That's a whole another discussion in itself. But that is the looming barrier after the security tax ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gary. I was going to put up the sign, and you made it into the corral in time. And what Gary has put on the table is just do it. So now we're going to hear from Michael and whether he's willing to leave retirement.
Well, certainly, Gary, when I took on this assignment to contribute to this discussion, it was not a job application. I really am quite happy in retirement because there's nothing as wonderful as being a full professor, never having to go through all the nonsense that other people do in order to become a full professor after retirement. As Wendy is doing the same thing. I can't think of a better job. So, David, Stephanie, thank you for organizing this. Wendy, thank you for moderating this, and thank you all for coming out this morning on what may be, to some people, a boring subject, but to me is not. And so let me tell you a little bit about why I think this is an important subject and why I think we need people like you to start becoming more actively engaged in convincing the people in Ottawa that the incremental agenda of the last 10 years really isn't good enough. Now, let me go back a little bit in history, and it's a little personal, but I think it'll help to explain why I am where I am. I was sitting here thinking, it was 24 years ago, this week, that I sat in a boardroom in Ottawa with Donald MacDonald and 10 other worthy Canadians who were part of the MacDonald Commission, and they were wrestling with whether or not to recommend in their big report to go for free trade. And they did. And the reason I was there, I was the only person there who was still a full-time public servant who had a day job. But I was there because they thought it was important to have somebody there who had some practical experience in the world of trade policy. Because they did not want to make an academic recommendation, they wanted to make a recommendation which was politically saleable. And so that's what they worked on. And it proved it was politically saleable. I think the time was right. The country was ready for it. I think the kind of problems that we were facing at that time were eminently suited to the negotiation of a free trade agreement between Canada and the United States. And the government of Brian Mulroney took up the challenge, successfully negotiated it. I was lucky enough to be part of that team, and I think that I will never have as big a high as concluding that agreement. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I retired. Because after a few years, it was clear to me that as far as Canada was concerned, trade policy was done. Sure, there were going to be lots of people doing trade policy work for the next few years, and there, if you go around Ottawa, you can probably find 400 or 500 people who are engaged in the government's trade policy. But as far as I was concerned, it was done. The trade policy that was initiated in the 1930s with the Canada-U.S. free trade agreement of that year, which is called the Good Neighbor policy between the Roosevelt administration and the King government, that trade policy was done with the FTA. And so in retirement, I started thinking about what really is the next challenge. And the next challenge, and that's why, it's nice that Gary told us about where the principal candidates are on trade policy. Me, I don't care where they are on trade policy, because the agenda that we have with the United States is not a trade policy agenda. It's an integration agenda. What we have to do over the next few years is come to terms with the fact that the Canadian and U.S. economy have become deeply integrated. They've become deeply integrated because of the trade policy that we pursued from 1935 through 1995. So 60 years of successful negotiations, bilaterally and multilaterally, created a much more integrated Canada-U.S. economy, particularly the free trade agreement. It allowed Canadian business to become partners in the North American economy. And that's what we really have become. As Stephen Blank from Pace University puts it, Canada and the United States really don't trade with each other anymore. They build things together. And that's a very different kind of agenda than we've had in the past, this building things together agenda. Because in doing that, there are a number of problems that we need to surmount. Some very interesting work has been done by the people at Stats Canada. Now, I know most of you probably don't read the kind of stuff that they put out because it's very boring, but in that boring stuff, there's some interesting stuff. One of the things that they have been able to demonstrate is the extent to which Canadian exports to the United States engaged imports from the United States. The automotive industry, as you would expect, is the most highly integrated. the import content of Canadian automotive exports is 60%. But what's really interesting is that we now even have imports in our agricultural exports to the United States. I did some work in the beef industry a couple of years ago to look at the problems of BSE, which was a major problem for Canada. We lost about $6 billion in economic output as a result of the BSE crisis. And we had that crisis because we have an integrated North American beef industry. When you get your Alberta steak, it really isn't an Alberta steak. What it is a calf that was born in Alberta, that was brought up to 3 months in Alberta, and then was shipped to Montana to eat grass there for the next 12 months. May have been brought back to Alberta in order to get fattened up at a feedlot, and then put back on a truck or a train and sent to Chicago to be, well, whatever they do in Chicago. But the result is they then put it in a box and send it here. That's an integrated industry. And so whatever sector of the economy you look at, we have an integrated Canada-U.S. economy. But when you look at the statistics for the last few years, you see a very disturbing trend. Gary already alluded to that. When you look at the statistics, we reached a high point in real terms in the year 2000. Took a dip then, and it's been stagnant ever since. Stagnant in terms of truck traffic, stagnant in terms of human traffic, stagnant in terms of goods and services crossing the border. And it's stagnant because we have not addressed the problem of integration. And the problem of integration is threefold: the border, regulations, and institutional capacity. So the integration agenda that Canada and the United States face, that we have to address over the next few years, is what are we going to do about the border? What are we going to do about regulatory differences? And what are we going to do about the fact that we need to be able to make joint decisions? Now first let's look at the border. You know, as a trade negotiator for many years, I thought we were solving the border problem by getting rid of the tariff, because I always looked upon customs officers as being largely tariff officers. Well, I sent a graduate student to do some work for me to find out what it is that these clowns at the border do. Guess what? On the Canadian side of the border, they are responsible for ensuring compliance with 96 statutory instruments on behalf of about 20 departments and agencies in Ottawa. So it's not just the tariff that they're interested in, or rules of origin, but all kinds of other things are administered at the border. Then I said, well, find out what they do on the U.S. side. There it was even worse. They're responsible for ensuring 400 statutory instruments are complied with. So these are very, very busy people. And so when Winston Churchill talked about, you know, the Canada-U.S. border being the largest undefended border, that's because he was a government official and was ushered through there. For the rest of us, we know it's not an undefended border. On the U.S. side, there are immigration and customs officials with sidearms, and now our customs guys are getting their sidearms. It's a very defended border, and it's defended for all the wrong reasons. It's not defending us from people who do us harm, it's defending us from each other. And I really don't think we need that kind of defense. So the first thing that we have to do is to get around the fact that we're using the border to do things that don't need to be done at the border at all. Much of it should be done away from the border, through normal regulatory compliance procedures, as we do in the domestic economy. There are even things done at the border we don't need to do at all. And so that we then get the border down to the one thing that I think probably is important and the most difficult thing to tackle, and that's security. Concentrate on security. And then we learn that the border is really not the best place to do security, because what's done at the border is symbolism. The same kind of stupid symbolism that all of you experience every time you get on an airplane. They're concerned about knitting needles and nail files. And it makes the politicians feel that they've done something rather than really address the underlying problems. And so the border has become a symbol for politicians to say they are dealing with the problems of security. But you deal with security by much different strategies. You deal with it through intelligence sharing, through good police work and so on. Not by having a graduate of Algonquin College or Humber College or something that ask you if you have anything to declare. okay? So that's the border. We need to tackle the border. Now, one way to deal with the border is to deal with the second issue that Gary already brought up, and that's the issue of regulatory differences. Now, Gary says that I'm now the living expert on this. Not really. I'm the guy who's noisiest about this. I have become increasingly aware of the fact that Canada and the United States have two very similar but sufficiently different regulatory regimes to keep all kinds of people employed. This is a huge boondoggle. That's what regulatory differences between Canada and the United States really is all about. It's a boondoggle. It is about officials in Ottawa making sure that they have a job. And so I've written a number of papers on the subject and so on, and then they tell me, it's much more complicated than you think. Well, I knew that. I was a civil servant for 22 years, so I know that particular phrase. I've used it with ministers too. I had a nice meeting with Mr. Prentice, who's now responsible for this, and he got briefed right after that it's more complicated than Professor Hart thinks. Well, let me just give you one illustration of what Professor Hart thinks. Drug approvals, therapeutic drug approvals. Touchy subject, it's very important to be done right. The gold standard, the global gold standard in drug approval is the United States Food and Drug Administration. They have the money, they have the resources, they have the expertise. They have 10,000 people doing it. And they do it, you know, through cooperation with the NIH and other U.S. agencies, and they do a terrific job. We have 985 people in the health protection branch in Ottawa second-guessing the FDA. That's their job. They do exactly the same thing. They reach exactly the same conclusions, except it takes them a year longer so that we die a little quicker because we don't have access to the newest therapeutic drugs. I don't know what public policy purpose is served by doing it that way. I think a much better public policy would be served by saying, let's sit down with the United States and see how we can work it out to have a North American drug approval regime where we work together. Mutual recognition, common protocols, and so on. Gary mentioned food safety. As a matter of fact, we have an intricate network of cooperation between the U.S. food inspection system and the Canadian food inspection system. They have something like 1,700 protocols between them on food inspection. Most of us are unaware of the fact. When you buy fresh fruits, the fresh fruit that's over there, most of which comes from South America and Africa, landed originally in Philadelphia, where it was inspected by the U.S. FIS and then trucked up here without further inspection. So we already have a lot of those protocols, but all of this, and this is the critically important point, all of this is done under the radar screen. None of it is done with political oversight. None of it is based on a strategic plan. And so what we need in Canada is a strategic plan. I won't go as far as Gary, that has hired me as the regulatory convergence czar. I don't want the job. I think there needs to be a minister, however, who's put in charge of that and who's given a mandate to do it for real. Now, somebody from the government will tell me, we've done it, we've got it, we're doing it. It's called the SPP, the Security and Prosperity Partnership. Nonsense. The Security and Prosperity Partnership is one of the greatest cons that's been visited upon the government in years. This is where officials repackage a program that they started in 1995. This is the 5th repackaging of that program, which guarantees them visits back and forth, many meetings and so on, and no progress. No progress because they have agreed, both sides have agreed that they will not do anything that will require legislative change. That is, they're working within existing legislative frameworks. And when you work within existing legislative frameworks, it's just a playground for officials rather than a recipe for progress. And so what we need is not an SPP, but a solemn program of cooperation between the two governments that leads to what Alan Gottlieb calls the big idea. We need to have a much deeper treaty relationship between our two countries governing this kind of idea. This needs political momentum. This needs political leadership. This needs to be put at the top of the Canada-U.S. agenda. And if we're going to do this, we need to have institutional capacity between our two countries. This is the most complicated, largest, most important relationship in the world. And there are very few institutions to govern it. We have many more institutions to govern the relationship with the European Union, where we have twice annual senior meetings of officials, summits, ministers' meeting, and so on, a whole panoply. 5 minutes, oh, that's fine. We have a whole panoply of gatherings and so on to govern a relationship which takes up about 5% of our trade. In the United States, which covers about 75% of our trade, if you take both imports, exports, goods and services and so on, we have the Canada-U.S. Mexico Free Trade Commission, which meets once a year to deal with small technical issues. What we need is a much more robust institutional framework within which governments can make serious decisions. And so that's the agenda that I see. It's not a trade agenda. It's not a trade policy agenda. It is an integration agenda. It recognizes the reality of who we are, where we live, who we need to work with, what our future is. Our future does not lie in the never-ending go-around. It does not lie in free trade agreements with Peru and the Dominican Republic. It lies in getting the Canada-U.S. relationship right and pursuing the issues that we want. Now, on a final note, in order to do this, we're going to have to do something else. And I think this government is doing it, but that's regained the confidence of the United States of Canada as a reliable security partner. We were a reliable security partner. We frittered it away. We're now rebuilding it, and we must continue to rebuild it, or else the rest of the agenda will not work. Because as far as Washington is concerned, Canada is only on the radar screen as a security partner. And so if we want to make progress on these very important economic issues, we have to demonstrate, without a shadow of a doubt, that we are a reliable security partner. We get that right, then we can pursue this other agenda. So the message that I have is, Toronto, speak to Ottawa. It's time to get moving. Thank you.